Ladies and gents, welcome to CG Reacts, and this is Europe prepares for war. This was a task and purpose. It's a latest video 3 days ago. Yeah, I guess it makes sense since Trump, let's just say certain decisions Trump made with its own allies, US's allies, with tariffs and things, how he dealt with Ukraine. This makes Europe think, okay, you know what, like we can't rely on US now. On top of that, Trump is talking about Greenland. And literally recently he just said like, okay, military is not off the table when it comes to Greenland negotiation, implying that he'll use military like a fucking conquest if he have to take Greenland, which will cause a massive issue between US and Europe, let's just say. But this is not about allies anymore. If that shit happens, a lot of European countries will literally be enemy of USA. Like, that's weird when you really think about it. So I don't know. So yeah, Europe is gonna like want to spend more money in military now, right? So we'll see how they're planning that. Task and Purpose, great channel, right? Topics about this. We'll see the details about it. So let's watch this one.
Preparing for war in the hopes of deterring it from happening in the first place. European leaders just announced a massive military spending spree when they unveiled this $840 billion plan, officially known as the Rearm Europe plan, unofficially known as the Don't F with Europe plan. The EU chief said, quote, "Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending to address the long-term need to take on much more responsibility for our own European security," end quote. It's a strong signal of their intent to remain a reliable ally to Ukraine, as billions of dollars will now pour into improving military readiness across the continent. Cooperation between the 28 different countries in Europe will increase as the post-World War II security order is radically reshaped. Welcome, Spare Parts Army. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, and today I want to examine the history of European defense cooperation and the new direction it's going in. We'll take a look at the capabilities of the main European defense production companies that will see the greatest share of this defense money flowing to them. And we'll analyze the changes this might have on the nuclear posture on the continent. The European defense idea, a brief history. These changes remind me of an idea that's been floated by politicians and military advisors for decades. In October 1950, France proposed a wild idea. European army. This was in the ashes of World War II, so we have to remember this was a very different idea of European countries like the UK, Germany, and Italy coming together and cooperating on security. It seemed crazy. They'd just been at war with each other for years. It seemed far-fetched. However, French Prime Minister René Pleven made a proposal for what was called the European Defense Community. It had some major differences compared to what NATO would become. It would have the authority above all nations, and it would share one common budget. In this very different timeline, there would be shared weaponry and procurement across Europe. France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg would combine forces. One of its original goals was to prevent Germany from becoming a standing army again so soon after World War II. France proposed the Pleven Plan to form a multinational European defense force that would have German troops mixed into it alongside other allies, instead of forming their own national German army. The other intention was to have what was called the Inner Six countries to strengthen defense against the Soviet threat. The way the alliance has always framed itself is as a protection of liberal values against an oppressive, authoritarian regime of the Soviet Union. In fact, this European army got very close to actually happening in May 1952 when all the countries signed the treaty. For the following 2 years, a lot of planning was put into action on how to create this new European army within NATO. By 1954, the United Kingdom was in approval of the plan and stated in an official document that they would play ball by, quote, joining and developing a common policy in technical fields such as training, tactical doctrine, logistics, and standardization of equipment. The United States was also a strong proponent pushing for the European army. The European army would have multinational divisions that would use even a common uniform.
I mean, it just makes sense. Europe has been at war with each other for centuries, not decades, centuries, millennia, why the fuck not? And yeah, if Europe, NATO, like most of the Europe has their own like common army like that, chances of them fighting each other is like really low, isn't it? So everybody's like, yeah, this just makes sense. I'm tired of Europe and its wars all the time. It was one of those things.
I vote we go with Belgium's jigsaw pattern. That shit's tight. But the whole plan was scrapped at the last minute when France didn't ratify the treaty in 1954. Some of the possible reasons for this is because the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died in 1953, and the armistice ending the Korean War was signed shortly after. It seemed like an era of peace was on the horizon with no need for a European army. Instead, what happened was Germany was fully admitted into NATO, and they stood up a national army of their own. Collective defense in Europe would be done through NATO, which would be US-led, and would have far less authority over how each country's army chose to develop. With NATO, the European countries were firmly on the same team. It accomplished one of the goals of preventing infighting amongst the member states. I have Italian ancestry, for example, and that's where my family comes from, and I know sometimes us Italians throughout history, we've gotten a little bit of ambition, and we did the whole Roman Empire thing, conquering left and right. With NATO, that wouldn't be a concern anymore. NATO and the United States military security guarantee made the idea of a European army seem unnecessary at the time. Today, there are still some proponents of the idea of the European army. They say that the benefit of this would be it would have one single leader who could make military decisions quickly instead of getting signed off on from multiple different countries. It would have one strong army instead of 27 smaller ones. The European army could have the power of procurement, which would mean that there would be one type of main battle tank instead of a handful of different types and different variants that are currently in service. So the modern push.
Yeah, but NATO's kind of already was doing that in a lot of ways, but yeah, now it would be like more streamlined than that. And yeah, German engineering, why the fuck not Leopard tanks and things like that? That would make sense, right? So NATO was already kind of like, okay, NATO should have like one type of equipment, even if like all countries have that different, but they should be similar in a way. That NATO was already doing that, but now it's just going to be one that type of it. Makes sense.
Push for European defense autonomy. Today, the idea is still around. Leaders from France and Ukraine have called for its creation of a European army, but the idea is widely seen as politically and practically impossible for a number of reasons. Each country already has their own proud military history and traditions, but I bring this concept up because I think it's a fascinating piece of history that connects.
Yeah, modern world is kind of like powerful and rich already compared to the past. France has a decent army. Britain has like decent as in like powerful enough. Sweden, everybody, Germany, they are powerful enough militaries. They can just expand their own. Why would you give up your sovereignty now to have one European military? Well, like who makes decision, right? Like in the end, yeah, it's a committee or whatever, but it usually dissolve into like maybe some leader from France makes a decision or some leader from Britain makes decision. Everybody else will be pissed off about it. So like, yeah, let's keep somewhat sovereignty when it comes to military type of it. Makes sense. So I don't think that's probably going to happen. One singular European military, that's not going to happen.
Directly to what's happening today. And while a unified European army remains maybe unlikely, some key elements of the concept are resurfacing under this new Rearm Europe plan. We're seeing very familiar characteristics being implemented with this defense spending increase. What we're really talking about is collective defense. Take a look at the EU's coordinated annual review of defense documents. When you're as autistic as me, reading this kind of shit is like reading one of your favorite Harry Potter books. Notice how on page 8 they outline the list of priorities including air defense, kamikaze drones, electronic warfare, long-range precision artillery, and ground combat vehicles. The German think tank Wasserspiegelblog, which I definitely said that correctly, claims that a more realistic approach would be something like a shared transport fleet and shared satellite intelligence gathering capability. Creating these kinds of networks are extremely expensive, even for one
that makes sense. Like regional support things like satellites, all this like flying radars and whatever they just showed. Shit like this, like if they share it, that makes more sense. Because these are the things that obviously makes modern military modern. Like you kind of fucking need that. But it's also expensive, hard to maintain, hard to update. There's a reason people are just pouring a lot of money just to do that. If every country does that, that's a waste because European countries are smaller comparatively to all the other like China, USA, India, shit like that. So if they collectively just have one thing for that, that makes sense.
Large member states in the EU. These strategic enablers would see the EU pool resources to create them. The EU chief isn't currently calling for the creation of a European armed forces, but is calling for some of the qualities of it. For instance, they would have potentially a single market for European arms manufacturers. The EU aims to create a single standard for some weapon systems and joint orders from various countries, paid from one single defense fund. Some aspects of both systems here. The EU chief said, quote, "Because the question is no longer whether Europe's security is threatened in any real way, or whether Europe should shoulder more of the responsibility for its own security. In truth, we have long known the answers to those questions," end quote. Have you ever heard of the EU Battle Group or EU Corps? Probably not. But it's evidence cooperation here is possible.
Look, here's what I'm going to say, right? Europe should have always kept that, like keeping your own security on your shoulder type of thing. I get it because of NATO and USA, they put a lot of on the US's shoulder. And it's not only Europe's fault. USA kind of played that part as well. Like, we're going to do everything because we want to have our fingers in every pot and everything, right? Like, we want bases everywhere. USA kind of did that. But Europe should have like kept their own interest. Like, okay, we need to put more into our own military. Germany is like the third biggest economy, and like their spending in NATO is close to nothing, like comparatively, how much US has spent and everything like that. So that's insane, right? So I don't know. They should have done this from the start. It's a good thing in the end they're deciding to do this. I know people are like, oh, it's just like more money wasted. Yeah, but defense is important. In the end of the day, humans are going to be humans. You will always need military and defense, right? If you want to be safe, you need to spend it, right? And relying on somebody else is basically cause issue if some big threat arises that threatens entire Europe. Now you can't suddenly build your military. Basically, it would happen how it happened in Ukraine. If something suddenly happens, what is Europe going to do? Right? So this is a good thing in a way.
EU Corps was founded by France and Germany in 1992, and it will have a future role as the headquarters for the EU Battle Group. The EU Battle Group consists of 60,000 personnel from several different countries. It's technically outside of NATO and meant to reduce operational dependency on the United States, which would allow EU military formations to function more autonomously. Air power is another place where we've seen a lot of cooperation. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland combined their air forces under a unified command. There's now 250 military aircraft strong under that command. Increased cooperation between these organizations begins to show us what the grand strategy for European defense will look like in the future. Currently, the combined firepower of the NATO European member states is impressive. At 1.5 million personnel, roughly 5,000 main battle tanks, 6,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 6,000 combined artillery pieces, and 1,800 fighter jets. And when you compare those capabilities to Russian forces, Russia has 1.5 million personnel, roughly 3,000 tanks, 3,000 IFVs, and about 800 fighter aircraft.
Hey man, do they still have that after the war? Like how many of them are like properly like 100% condition? Like Russia's stats, like nowadays we really have to look at it because they are under war. In war, like how much equipment damage has happened? Like who knows?
Russian forces were held off by Ukraine for 3 years, and Ukrainian troops didn't have any of the strategic enablers or strategic bombers that NATO has. Europe outnumbers Russia in many categories. Comparing numbers against numbers like that, of course, leaves out a lot of variables and factors, but it's useful at a very high level of a way of getting a sense for how to start to tackle some of these challenges. German think tank, the Kiel Institute, estimated where the additional $800 billion worth of defense spending could go. They recommended mobilizing 300,000 additional troops in 50 fast deployable brigades. Adding to these forces would be 1,400 new main battle tanks, 2,000 more infantry fighting vehicles.
Is that 800 billion per year? Because that shit is insane. That's like USA equivalent, right? If we treat Europe as one country, that would be like same spending as US. The US has to spend in a lot of things like million bases around the planet and shit like that. And like, maintaining the equipment they already have, which are insanely high.
Vehicles and 700 artillery pieces, including multiple rocket launchers. The report suggests additional defense funds be focused on mechanized ground power to replace the U.S. Army's heavy brigades. They recommended producing 2,000 long-range attack drones each year. All that mass, basically the way they came to those numbers is they looked at what the estimates for what the US military's commitment would be in the event of war with Russia, and they decided that they would need to replace that amount of mass. I think a lot of times think tank information gets thrown around willy-nilly, but this institute is legitimately a very influential one in Europe, and what they say is recommended to and listened to by policymakers. The European defense industry scaling up. A key challenge, though, that we haven't talked about yet is the European defense industry's ability to ramp up production to meet these needs. And that's what we'll examine in this section. The EU chief stated that 150 billion euros from the defense fund would need to be spent on weapons from European manufacturers. She said, quote, "These loans should finance purchases from European producers to help boost our own defense industry," end quote. They specifically mentioned purchasing more air defense and missiles, as that would be the focus. Throughout the think tank's opinion articles that I've read, one of the common themes brought up is European defense industry production capacity. Does it have the ability to surge and cover down on the US military's ability to pump out metal? The first key company to look at is BAE Systems out of the United Kingdom. One of their main focuses is the design of ground combat vehicles. They created the Bradley IFV, but those are produced in America. They also created the CV90, which...
Wait a minute, British created Bradleys? What the fuck? I mean, it makes sense. Creator of tanks, they are gonna like pursue this, why not?
Is produced in Europe. Thanks to joint ventures, they're able to pump out a lot of vehicles. Not necessarily in the United Kingdom, but if you look at their plant in Höglands, Sweden, they've produced hundreds, over 1,000 armored units. I read BAE's 2024 annual production report in my spare time because it's a lot easier to do that than make new friends in your mid-30s. What I found on page 17 is that they're investing $200 million to add capacity and to scale up their operations.
Yeah, in your mid-30s. Hey, how you doing? You want to hang out? Wait a minute, I don't have time. I have family, I have a job. I literally have no time. Okay, no friends then.
They added plants to expand production capacity inside countries that buy them. So they've already built 1,400 of the CV90s, to give you an idea. And I used Control F to find other mentions of the CV90 in that document because I'm not going to pretend like I read the whole thing. And I learned on page 45 that a third weld line for CV90s is under construction and expected to be operational in 2026. It's crazy what you can learn in some of those investor documents, but it shows us production is quickly scaling. The president of BAE said, quote, "We've invested in new, expensive machinery in order to multiply our initial production capacity, first by 4 and then by 6. They've acquired welding robots and laser cutting machines that move 3 times as quickly. What we're seeing is Europe preparing what they're calling a united military-industrial complex strategy. These companies we're going over right now in this section will be involved in this joint projects worth billions of dollars. After BAE is Rheinmetall from Germany. They have their paws in everything, but some of their biggest focus is in tanks, artillery production, and notably some of the sophisticated air defense systems. Rheinmetall has significant manufacturing potential. Proof of this comes from their rapid expansion of artillery shell production. They're on track to hit 1.1 million artillery shells per year by 2027. You can see how people think these European defense companies are going to perform in the future based on how hard their stocks are going up and to the right. Rheinmetall is another of those companies where you might think they're not pumping out steel because German army doesn't have shitloads of new vehicles, but again, they've set up new manufacturing facilities in Hungary and Ukraine producing main battle tanks. So they're combined facilities from like Australia, Netherlands, Germany.
One thing I'm going to give Germany and German engineering is that they will solve problems. Okay, we need to worry about logistics. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by doing it, and they just fucking do it. Right? So Rheinmetall getting bigger and bigger, like that does, yeah, it makes sense. Right? Recently there was a video about like how they are competing with other arms manufacturer to be the dominant one. So yeah, I can see Germany becoming powerful again in just few years because they've always been that. Right? They just shift focus. They shift focus from like war to like, I don't know, automobile and shit. And look at how powerful they are there. Right? They're going back to the military equipment. They're going to be like dominant. They were already in military equipment, but not at the scale.
UK produces 200 Boxer IFVs annually. Between them and the other German defense company Krauss-Maffei, they're pumping out over 200 tanks annually. Next, I'd like to introduce you from my friend Thales from France. They're perhaps most famous and specialized for production of space-based systems, which would be absolutely instrumental in reducing reliance on the United States space-based intelligence network. The United States has 246 military satellites compared to the 49 from European NATO members. This is one aspect where Europe will need several years to build up this capacity. Then there's Leonardo, which is the Rome, Italy-based company. This company is probably most famous for their helicopter production with their multi-role platform, but they actually just announced a joint partnership with Turkey's Baykar.
Wait a minute, did they name it after Da Vinci? Because that would make sense. He was like tinkering with all the shit all the time.
To pump out a bunch of drones, which is seen as a direct response to this hike in European defense spending. Then, of course, you've got fan favorite Saab, who's got 100 years of experience in building submarines. Defense of the Baltic Sea is something
They're gonna make submarines that even with the bomb, nothing's gonna happen to it. Should we put armor plating? What you talking about? The structure itself is armor plating. We are Saab.
that is often overlooked, but it's an important aspect. They're famous for producing rocket launcher, missiles, and Gripen fighter jets. Airbus is another company, and like the name suggests, is vital for production of some of those strategic airlift assets like the A400M Atlas transport aircraft and the A330 MRTT refueling tanker. Logistics and transportation is going to be vital for moving forces on a moment's notice. And here, many defense experts agree Europe already has good existing capabilities. If you're starting to notice what I'm driving at here, it's that each defense company in Europe fills a need and brings something different to the table. It's just getting them to cooperate that can be a challenge. It's worth noting that these companies do a wide range of different things that I didn't mention. These are just some of the...
You think making European countries cooperate is a challenge? Yeah, that's an understatement. I don't know. In the modern world, I think like they would cooperate good enough. They see threat in the whole common enemy usually like bands people together. Russia is common enemy. I don't know.
Aspects they specialize in. There are, of course, a bunch of other smaller yet important European defense companies that I didn't mention, but those are some of the highlights. Manpower and changing strategic landscape. Okay, those are some of the companies that will power the defense industry in terms of cold, hard metal, and steel, but what about human resources? Not HR, but skilled soldiers and shit. After the end of the Cold War, European
resources that are humans, yeah.
Countries downsized their militaries, and we saw key contributors of manpower like France suspend conscription, and there was a reduction of force sizes by 40%. Which shows us Europe can generate the manpower if they need to. Before Europe and NATO's grand strategy was partially built around the presupposition that the United States military would guarantee security of the alliance. This is why forward stationing a small contingent of like 11,000 troops in Lithuania or Estonia was seen as credible, as a deterrent to Russian forces, because there was a clear link to the much larger US forces which would come in if that wire was tripped. However, if that guarantee was removed, there then becomes a need for some kind of large standing force in Europe. Part of the United States' contribution is their strategic bomber fleet, which Europe doesn't appear to be trying to replace, but at that point, when we start talking about strategic bombers, instead of spending a country's entire GDP on developing a European B-2 bomber, they are instead talking about increased nuclear umbrella protection, and that's the nuclear question. Here we have to consider nuclear weapons. Currently, the United States military has about 100 of the B-61 gravity nuclear bombs deployed at 6 bases in 5 European countries, in Italy, Germany, Belgium, and Netherlands. These air forces have strike missions pre-planned using those American bombs. But what if something happens and the United States says, no, you can't use those nuclear bombs? What's the alternative? In Europe, there are 2 countries that have nuclear weapons. There's France with roughly 290 and the United Kingdom with about 225. Meanwhile, Russia is estimated to have something like 5,000. The important thing to know here is that France has their own supply line and construction for nuclear weapons. They have complete independence on that front. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom works closely in joint operations with...
The thing is, if shit hits the fan, I don't think Europe's gonna listen to USA, because since the gravity bombs are in Europe, they're probably gonna use it anyway, regardless of what US says. It's about Europe's defense, and it's just like last measure thing. They're not gonna listen to it.
The United States on the development of their nuclear weapons. The British have the ability to launch those nukes from submarines, while France can launch from subs as well as from air-launched bombers. France has recently put it up for debate about whether their nuclear weapons could provide protection for Europe. If that were the case, it would mean creating a formal nuclear sharing agreement similar to the one that already exists that allows those United States nuclear weapons to be at those countries in Europe. The Kale publication points out that Europe will invest in building logistics capabilities to supply their forces. Europe aims to develop the logistics to stand up a bratwurst and beer tent anywhere within 24 hours, anywhere in Europe. New air transport and ground transport capabilities to replace US capabilities. But one solution to avoiding the need for that large standing army is a wall. A wall is time-tested throughout history. There was the Berlin Wall, the Great Wall of China, the Maginot Line, the wall at the southern border of the United States. Walls aren't going anywhere. Poland and the Baltic states have asked the European Union to build a 700-kilometer long wall around the border of Russia and Belarus.
And against cartels and drug empires, maybe walls would work. Stopping migrants getting in, yeah, maybe walls would work. Against a war, I don't think walls gonna stop a war. Enough artilleries and bombs would destroy a fucking wall. I guess surprise attack might not be there, but then again, maybe if done right, even that can happen. They could instantly destroy a wall and attack if they want to.
As seen in this map here. This is called the East Shield, and it would cost a total of $2.5 billion. The first target by Russia, if a war went hot, would be the most vulnerable, the Baltic states. They don't have as much defensive depth, with their capitals located barely 100 kilometers from the Russian and Belarusian borders. So how do you protect against that threat? Construction has already begun, with about 600 planned bunkers, fighting positions, Dragon's Teeth in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. There's $655 million worth of defensive fortifications. General Martin Rearm, he's Estonia's former top military officer, said the idea is to shape the attack instead of stop it, and to use long-range munitions once they enter. The Polish government, they use 70% of their increased defense funds to focus on purchasing new equipment like tanks, which has successfully resulted in more mass. But another factor to consider is a larger portion of the funding may need to be invested into recruiting personnel and training them. The economic feasibility of European defense expansion. Let's talk for a moment about the economics of this change. This might sound like a major challenge. However, in order to cover down on and replace the United States military's contributions, the EU is estimated to only have to spend another 0.12% of combined GDP. The European Commission is the executive body of the European Union, and they're responsible for proposing new laws and monitoring their implementation and managing the EU budget. Oftentimes, it requires unanimous decisions, so currently the hope is member states won't vote against this defense increase proposal. According to their estimates, though, it would take about $250 billion extra per year to effectively counter Russian military forces. While an additional $250 billion in annual defense spending might seem like a lot, it represents a GDP increase from 2% to 3.5% for the European countries. Europe's economic strength is massive. By comparison to Russia's, Russia is a $2 trillion economy. It's much smaller than the EU's $20 trillion GDP. Russia can pull from a population of 145 million, which is outnumbered by the EU's combined 450 million. Some countries like the UK are reducing their annual foreign aid to help pay for these defense increases in spending. They're also talking about issuing bonds from the European Investment Bank and using unspent money from COVID to help cover the defense costs. But the Rearm Europe plan is about developing a grand strategy for the continent that everyone can buy into. The military dilemma we're talking about here is a concept known as operational art. It's theater-level planning. Operational art was originally conceived of in Soviet military doctrine and later adopted by the US Army in the 1980s. The writing team on the US military doctrine originally thought that operational planning was too advanced of a theoretical concept for the US Army at large to comprehend. Gee, thanks guys for the vote of confidence. But operational art is about linking strategy and tactics to achieve a strategic goal. And the EU has just laid out what looks like a vision for what that might look like. The direction is clear. Europe is preparing for war on the European continent instead of trying to create armies that are half optimized for intervention in the Middle East or power projection against China. It appears they will prepare for war in order to hopefully prevent it from happening. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, signing off this net.
Yeah, Wait a minute, is this his last video? I'm pretty sure he said that in one of his clip. I don't know. Yeah, okay, look, first of all, what is that saying, right? Do diplomacy but prepare for war. That's the ultimate defense, right? Because that in itself shows power, strength element. Like, we are strong, so listen to diplomacy, that was shared. And it makes sense, man. The point here is like, will Europe stay united? If they do it, like, yeah, they're a powerhouse. They're basically another China with $20 trillion economy, 500 million people, right? If they do it, and not to mention European technology, right? That in itself gives them the edge. If they do that, like, yeah, they don't have much of threat from anything. But will they do that? That's the point. But yeah. Right, well, that was Europe prepares for war by channel Task and Purpose. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.